1945, 12 million Americans were on active military service in World War II. They had fought the Axis forces in all parts of the world since Pearl Harbor Day, December 7, 1941. In the spring of 1945, victory was beginning to favor the United States and her allies. With the American crossing of the Rhine River, the conflict was carried to the Nazi homeland. It was only a question of time before Germany must surrender. On April 6, 1945, death struck President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All men who would be free mourned the passing of the champion of liberty. In this time of crisis, Harry S. Truman succeeded to the presidency. The new president had entered national politics as senator from Missouri in 1934. Re-elected in 1940, he became an effective chairman of the Senate Committee on Defense Contracts. Mr. Truman was chosen to be President Roosevelt's running mate in 1944. Less than a month after Mr. Truman became president, Nazi generals came to Reims, France to surrender. General Dwight D. Eisenhower administered the surrender. VE Day, May 7, 1945. As the fall of Hitler was still being celebrated, the first test of an atom bomb on July 16th at Alamogordo, New Mexico was a success. This climaxed 3 years of top-secret research by an international team of scientists. President Truman was in Potsdam, Germany, conferring with Churchill and Stalin on German war reparations. During the conference, Clement Attlee succeeded Mr. Churchill as Britain's prime minister. At Potsdam, the president received information on the A-bomb test. The decision was made jointly with Britain to use the threat of the bomb to force Japan to surrender immediately. On August 6th, 3 B-29s took off from Tinian Island in the Pacific for Japan. The Japanese government had rejected the Allied demand for immediate surrender. Japan was braced to resist the Allied invasion of its mainland. The Allied position was that the bomb could shorten the war by at least a year and thereby save an estimated 1 million Allied casualties. The first atomic bomb in warfare was dropped on Hiroshima. Three days later, a second A-bomb devastated the city of Nagasaki. On August 10th, the Japanese government issued an unconditional surrender. In Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, on the USS Missouri, the surrender became official with the signature of Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander Pacific Forces, gave the victory pen to General Wainwright, hero of Corregidor. With the war ended, President Truman told the world,
"We will face the problems of peace with the same courage that we have faced and mastered the problems of war."
Atomic energy for peace or war? This was the question. In August 1946, the President signed into law an act creating the Atomic Energy Commission and providing civilian control of all atomic development in close cooperation with the military services. Mr. Truman appointed the commission. It established the search for constructive uses of atomic energy in health, agriculture, and industry. The removal of wartime restrictions created economic problems. Strikes closed the steel mills and shut down automotive plants. A walkout of railway workers halted trains for 2 days. It was settled on policies recommended by the president. When Chicago meat processors went out on strike, the government seized the plants in the public interest, and packers returned to their jobs. The Army, the Air Force, and the Navy were unified under a Department of Defense. The first Secretary of Defense with cabinet rank was James D. Forrestal.
The National Security Act of 1947 constitutes the most decisive step taken by the United States in the formation of a national military policy since the foundation of the Republic.
With the Republican Party in control of both houses, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which made substantial changes in the Wagner Labour law. Senator Robert Taft, the sponsor, explained the bill thus.
The committees which wrote this bill had no anti-union prejudice. They have tried to restore equality in collective bargaining and correct only those abuses against employers, union members, and third parties which were clearly shown to exist by bona fide evidence.
The president disapproved the act and vetoed it.
If we weaken our system of collective bargaining, we weaken the position of every working man in the country.
Congress overrode the veto despite strong labor opposition. The act became law on June 23, 1947. As President Truman's term drew to a close, the Democratic Party convened in Chicago in the summer of 1948 to name its candidates. Mr. Truman was renominated with Senator Alvin W. Barkley as his vice presidential running mate. Public opinion polls heavily favor the Republican nominee, Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York.
That we're going to come out of this election stronger, more united, more productive, and more effective than we've ever been before, and don't let anybody on earth misunderstand it.
Undisturbed by forecasts of his defeat, Mr. Truman campaigned confidently on his fair deal platform.
To work for the improvement of the conditions here at home, to curb inflation, to provide low-rent housing, give aid to education, extend civil rights, and scores of other ways. I shall continue to work for these goals with all my strength.
The voters returned Mr. Truman to the White House in a surprising upset victory with 304 electoral votes. In President Truman's second term, Congress created the Housing and Finance Agency to remedy serious housing shortages and to encourage home ownership and construction. As the crop of war babies reached school age, shortages of classrooms and modern school buildings added to existing post-war problems in many communities. However, federal bills to provide aid to education were defeated. Subversive activities of the American Communist Party were exposed and proven when Judge Harold Medina found 11 of its leaders guilty of criminal conspiracy against the government. Additional Red infiltration was investigated by a Senate committee when Undersecretary Alger Hiss was accused by Whittaker Chambers. Despite denials, Hiss was convicted of perjury. In a constructive, nonpartisan move, President Truman appointed former President Herbert C. Hoover to lead a commission on the reorganization of the executive branch of the government.
So that one of the first desires of this commission and its first principle of work has been to try to reduce the number of those agencies.
The only living ex-president at that time, Mr. Hoover filled an important role as an elder statesman. In San Francisco, before World War II ended, representatives of 50 countries met to form the United Nations organization. They drafted a charter outlawing aggression and establishing for all peoples the principles of freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to choose their own governments. With victory for the Allies, tyranny in the form of totalitarianism was destroyed for the time being. Upon Germany's surrender, Hermann Goering and other Nazi leaders were brought to justice. The International Court at Nuremberg, fixing individual responsibility for guilt, convicted them of crimes against humanity. The war had left deep suffering throughout Europe. Homes, schools, churches, and hope were all but destroyed. By using the menace of occupation troops and taking advantage of the homeless and the starving peoples of many Eastern European countries, communists grasped control of their governments, stifling their freedom behind an iron curtain. To check the spread of communism to Greece and Turkey, President Truman asked Congress for an appropriation of $400 million for aid to those countries. In what became known as the Truman Doctrine, food and supplies were shipped abroad, and Greece and Turkey remained in the ranks of the free democratic nations. Extending the Truman Doctrine, a vast international program of economic assistance was proposed by Secretary of State Marshall.
Men are to be left free to organize their social, political, and economic existence in accordance with their desires.
Through the Marshall Plan, the United States provided $12 billion to assist the economic recovery of 14 European countries and provide humanitarian aid to their peoples. This was a period of the emergence of new nations. On May 14, 1948, Israel became an independent state, and in the next year elected David Ben-Gurion Prime Minister. On October 25, 1949, in ceremonies dedicating the Permanent Secretariat of the United Nations, President Truman joined with his former election opponent, Governor Dewey of New York. Trygve Lie of Norway, Secretary General of the United Nations, helped to place the cornerstone of the building dedicated to world peace. But in Berlin, the Cold War between the East and the West reached a new crisis as the Russians withdrew from the four-power commandantura that governed the city since the war's end. On April 1, 1948, the Reds imposed a blockade to force the Allies out of the city. They stopped all deliveries of goods from West Germany. General Lucius D. Clay, American military governor in Germany, demanded an Allied airlift to deliver the necessities of life. The airlift maintained round-the-clock deliveries for 13 months. In that period, more than 2¼ million tons of goods were flown into Berlin's Tempelhof Airport. The airlift broke the blockade. On May 12, 1949, the Russians removed their barriers and normal traffic from West Germany again flowed into Berlin. In China, a faction later identified as communistic under the leadership of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai fought the nationalist government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. After an American mission attempted unsuccessfully to negotiate a settlement between the nationalists and their opponents, the United States government ended its efforts and issued a white paper on China. The nationalists fled from the mainland to the island of Formosa. The loss of China to the Reds led to charges by Senator Joseph McCarthy that communists held important posts in our State Department. The president denounced the charges, but appointed a loyalty board for selective clearance of federal employees. To curb communism in Europe, 12 nations joined in forming the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For the first time in its history, the United States entered a peacetime military alliance with other nations. Secretary of State Acheson signed the treaty for the United States in the presence of President Truman and Vice President Barclay. General Eisenhower became Supreme NATO Commander after a brief period of civilian life. The Berlin blockade had exposed Russian intentions to control Germany in the future. In contrast, America, Britain, and France set up free elections in West Germany. Konrad Adenauer became Chancellor of the new West German Republic. In East Germany, the Russians established a puppet communist government, another satellite state. In 1949, President Truman announced that Russia had developed an atomic bomb. In the UN, American advisor Bernard Baruch proposed international control of atomic development.
To make a choice between the quick and the dead. That is our business. The United States proposes the creation of an international atomic development authority.
Russia's Foreign Minister Andrei Vyshinsky rejected the proposal, and the world now faced a new threat, atomic war. The uneasy peace that had existed since VJ Day finally flared into war when communist North Korean forces invaded the Free Republic of South Korea, crossing the 38th parallel. Through Ambassador Warren Austin, the President appealed for joint UN action to halt this aggression. 11 nations volunteered troops for an international police force led by General MacArthur. The UN force cut off the communists' advance by a strategic landing at Incheon. It fought its way to liberate Seoul, the capital of South Korea. The Communist Army was pushed back toward the Yalu River, which forms the border between North Korea and Manchuria. President Truman flew to Wake Island to confer with General MacArthur. Even as they talked, Mao Zedong's communists in Manchuria were preparing to come to the aid of the North Koreans. The Chinese communists entered the war and forced a UN retreat from the Yalu River. MacArthur struck back and planned to attack Chinese bases in Manchuria. President Truman upheld UN policy forbidding its forces to go into Manchuria because it might lead to global atomic warfare. MacArthur's outspoken criticism of this policy caused the president to replace him with General Matthew Ridgway. After 2 years, a ceasefire was negotiated at Keesong, and peace conferences were continued at Panmunjom. The 38th parallel remained the dividing line between communist and free Korea as the war ended in stalemate. In 1952, President Truman announced that he would not seek re-election. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Republican candidate, defeated Adlai E. Stevenson, the Democratic nominee. On January 21, 1953, Harry S. Truman accompanied President Eisenhower to his inauguration. Later, he boarded a train in Washington to return to private life at his home in Independence, Missouri, after 19 years of active service to his government. On his birthday in 1955, in keeping with his lifelong interest in history, he took part in ceremonies establishing the Truman Library to house the private documents of his life's work. The library has since been opened as a resource where students and historians may seek, among the records related to World War II, the atomic bomb, the formation of the United Nations, the Taft-Hartley Law, the division of Germany, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, the Fair Deal, NATO and the Korean conflict for the solutions to the ever-pressing problems of government.